Here's an experiment for you. Take passionate experts in human resource technology. Invite cross-industry experts from inside and outside HR. Mix in what's happening in people analytics today. Give them the technology to connect. Hit record. Pour their discussions into a beaker. Mix thoroughly. And voila, you get the HR Data Labs podcast, where we explore the impact of data and analytics to your business. We may get passionate and even irreverent, but count on each episode challenging and enhancing your understanding of the way people data can be used to solve real-world problems. Now, here's your host, David Turetsky.
Hello and welcome to the HR Data Labs podcast. I am your host, David Turetsky. Today we have a very special episode for you. This is a presentation that Garry Straker and myself gave at the SHRM National Conference in Las Vegas, Nevada in May of 2023. The title of the presentation was Avoiding Unintended Consequences of Pay Transparency. We had a blast actually doing the presentation, and hopefully you'll enjoy it. Take care and stay safe.
I want to thank everybody for joining today. I understand that the only thing standing between sort of dinner, perhaps a concert, and an NHL championship final tonight is me and David. So we'll do our best to keep this entertaining, or I should really say that David will do his best to keep it entertaining. I'll do my best to keep it on track. Just by way of a quick introduction, so David and I lead up the compensation consulting practice for Salary.com. We have the great privilege, and we also have a lot of fun helping organizations really throughout the country, some internationally, help design and build compensation programs to better meet their business needs. And so we love talking about this stuff, and obviously pay transparency is a big issue nowadays. I think so. SHRM referred to 2022 as the year of pay transparency. So I'd like to begin the session with a public service announcement. The pay transparency train has left the station, folks. And everybody in this room is going to have to get a lot more comfortable in terms of planning for, managing, and evaluating the impact of pay transparency on our organizations. I realize that for some of you, you'll take this right in stride because maybe that's consistent with your culture already. For some of you, it might be a little bit of a bumpy ride, right? There's a lot of good that can come out of pay transparency, and certainly, we're advocates of that, and we encourage our clients to be as transparent as possible about their pay practices. But there are also some pitfalls, right? There are some speed bumps, there are some pots in the road that you want to avoid. So that's what this session is about. We're hopefully going to share our insights, our perspective, our thoughts. We have a little bit of research, some data about this to hopefully help you avoid some of those mistakes that we've seen other folks make. David, I thought we would maybe just try to get a little bit of a pulse read on the room. So if the pay transparency train has left the station, how many of you are actually comfortably sitting on that train? You're clear about what the destination is. In other words, you have already embraced and put forth in your organization a pay transparency strategy. Show of hands. Anybody done that? So a good number of you already have. Right?
Awesome.
Good for you.
Good job.
And then there's probably a second group who, you may have found yourself on this train, maybe not quite sure how you got there, maybe have really no idea where it's going, and you're just hoping that it's going to land you in a good place. Anybody in an organization that's in that category? Okay, quite a few there.
Thank you for being honest.
But lastly, there's a group that may still be standing on the platform and wondering, are we supposed to be on that train? Anybody in that group at all? Okay. And that's okay.
This group over here has not answered very much, so we're going to have to focus on them a lot, okay?
And it's perfectly okay. We're going to help you along your journey regardless of what your starting point is. And I will tell you, I have missed, metaphorically, many trains in my life. But the important thing is you just have to get there eventually. Let's just talk about what we mean by pay transparency. Fairly obvious question. At a bare minimum, we're talking about sharing pay information or pay ranges for employees for the job that they do.
Pace of change in the world of business is fast, and that drives incredible complexity for the world of human resources.
Welcome to the HR Data Labs Brown Bag Lunch, a series of conversations with experts inside and outside the world of human resources on how to innovate, measure, and evolve our practices.
Our goal is to help provide you with practical examples of how HR has to change and to meet in this complex business environment.
Every week, we'll talk to new and different voices on all aspects of human resources.
And guess what? You get to chat with us live.
Live?
Live.
So they can answer questions or they can ask us questions.
They can ask, they can answer, whatever they want. They get to talk with us live.
That's awesome.
Sometimes we geek out on the data and technology that underlie the processes that drive the world of HR.
But the conversations are always insightful and fun. So please enjoy the HR Data Labs Brown Bag Lunch.
But I also think pay transparency needs to go a lot further. We need to really help our employees understand not just how much they're paid, but how they're paid. What are the underlying principles? What is our compensation philosophy? What is our intent? Are we instilling confidence in our employees that our compensation practices are administered consistently and fairly throughout the organization? And I think that that's an important, really a significant and important part of how we think about pay transparency. Pay transparency, not a new concept. We've been talking about this for years, right? Compensation professionals, HR professionals. A lot of debate and discussion about pay transparency. Some think it's like the worst idea since, forever. Others really do sort of embrace it. This is a Professor David Burkus. I love what he said. He, going back in 2007, I think it was 2016, he did a TED. And his quote is, letting people know what you make might feel uncomfortable, but isn't it less uncomfortable than wondering if you're being discriminated against or being paid unfairly? And I certainly think that's true. One thing about that quote today is that, even since 2016, we know that employees, especially younger employees, they are much more likely to share pay information amongst themselves. So even if we don't have pay transparency explicitly, we certainly have implied pay transparency because of basically employee behavior. Different organizations have taken different approaches to pay transparency. Some have embraced it. Whole Foods comes to mind. That's an organization that has had pay transparency. Apparently, if you're a Whole Foods employee, you can go in and see not only what you're paid, but what other employees have paid. Other organizations have taken it really to maybe the furthest extreme. One of those is a company called Buffer. Some of you may be familiar with Buffer. They're infamous, right, for fully disclosing their pay for all their employees, not only just internally, but they do it externally. And what they have found is that pay transparency builds trust. And that's one of the most significant and important outcomes of pay transparency, is instilling trust that employees feel that the compensation program has integrity, right? It is disciplined, it is structured, it is methodical, that you're not just shooting from the hip, right? A lack of trust or opacity in compensation can really lead to perceptions that things are probably not being done consistently and fairly throughout the organization. And that's certainly one of the things that you want to avoid. But Buffer, this is just a quick shot from their website. You can actually go onto Buffer's website and by department and by location, find out what everybody's paid. How many of in this room would ever be comfortable going this far in terms of that extreme? Anybody ever see that in their future? One person. Okay, your county government.
Right.
Okay,
so county government excluded because that's disclosed.
Yeah.
You have to. Thank you very much for offering that. That's cool.
Public sector, not uncommon. But in the private sector, this is really an unusual practice.
Very.
And not everyone is going to be comfortable with this degree of transparency because transparency is really a continuum. And every organization has to find the sweet spot for them in terms of what they're comfortable. An organization like Buffer, this is a technology startup based in New York City. Last time I checked Zoom info, they had about 200 employees, right? Some of you work for very large, mature, multinational organizations. You've grown through acquisition. You have legacy pay practices. You have decentralized decision-making. You have got all kinds of things going on in terms of how you administer pay. Yeah, probably this level of pay transparency is not going to work for you. But you should be able to find a sweet spot that is consistent with your organizational values and culture. And just lastly, this is another company that I like this quote. A company called Kepler, also in New York City, by the way. They have if you go onto their website, you see that they share a lot of information in terms of pay transparency. But their quote, if you can read it, in that little red box there says, "We believe every employee should understand," I can't even read it myself, "our compensation philosophy and practices." Now, wouldn't that be a thing, right? I mean, that just sounds so obvious to me that people should understand how they're paid. And again, that's just, I just sort of view that as common sense. But it helps establish trust and confidence that pay practices are, in fact, administered fairly. I'd like to just sort of switch gears. And so one of the things we know is that a lot of the push towards pay transparency is a result of new legislation that's occurring around the country, right? Just to take a quick inventory of that legislation, there are really two general themes in terms of the legislative activity at the state level. There's those states who require proactive disclosure of wage ranges to basically employees and job candidates, requiring wage range disclosure in job postings, right? So some of you probably have operations in those states, but certainly Colorado, California, New York, Washington, all require that proactive wage range disclosure. Other states have not gone quite so far. They require wage range disclosure generally to job applicants is the general theme, or upon request, right? And it even still, it's amazing to me, some organizations, I saw this recently in a handbook where it explicitly says in the employee's handbook that the policy was not to share wage range information for anything other than the employee's own job. Again, that feels to me like a little bit of an antiquated practice, right?
Well, in the 1990s when I worked for an investment bank, we literally told employees that if they did talk about pay, we were talking about bonuses, by the way, that we would let them go. Anybody have that as a kind of unwritten rule, maybe? I know not now, okay. We're trying to fight this, remember? We're on the same team. But there was that thought process, though, that if you talked about it, like they used to call it water cooler talk, that if you talked about it, you could get disciplined up to and including termination.
And thank goodness that's a relic of the past, right? Just recently, there are other states that have introduced, or actually have bills awaiting governor's signature. So 3 states now, Hawaii.
Wasn't Hawaii just signed?
Yeah, Hawaii, Illinois, and Maine, right? Anybody from Maine?
No.
One from Maine in the back.
Oh, okay.
Awaiting governor's signature bills requiring wage range disclosure in job postings, right? Massachusetts, my neighbor to the north, I'm from Connecticut, likely to fall into that category. We'll see how all that shakes out. Several other states, off the top of my head, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, all have bills in the process as it relates to pay transparency. This trend is going to continue. And even if it doesn't continue, the vast majority of employers and the vast majority of HR professionals we talk to aspire to much greater levels of pay transparency. Most of them, however, are just not ready for it right now. Unfortunately, time is not your friend here. Because in some cases, these new wage range disclosures become effective, within a few short months of the governor signing them into law. David, you were going to make a comment.
Yeah, I was going to say, we interviewed the state representatives who introduced the pay transparency law bill in Massachusetts on the HR Data Labs podcast, and they're very excited for one aspect of the law, and that's that it's simple. It's simple to comply. It basically says we want you to disclose a relevant range of pay for the job. That's all it says. It's not very complicated, and it should be something that you should be able to apply very simply. Now, I wouldn't test them on that, because to the extent at which you're going to try and do what Netflix... Do we have anybody from Netflix here, by the way? Okay, they're not here. So for those of you who saw, Netflix posted a flight attendant job. Does anybody see this? $60,000 to $385,000 for a flight attendant job for Netflix. This wasn't an actor playing a flight attendant. This was actually a flight attendant job. Do you think that, anybody from California here? Do you think that you could post that range and get away with it? Exactly, so don't do that. By the way, we're not giving legal advice here. I don't know if we said that before. But don't do that. That's good legal advice. It's free. It's not really legal advice.
And so we had a couple of questions. So let's just maybe pause. I think you had your hand up here. So great question. So the question was, with this legislation, is it based on where the company is located, where the job is located, or where they report to? It varies. Generally speaking, though, if you report, like for instance in Illinois, if you report to an organization based in Illinois or headquartered in Illinois, you are subject to it. Each state has slightly different nuance on this, but generally speaking, remote workers who report into a location within a state that has just passed legislation are subject to the law. And there's also, in some cases, there are number of employee thresholds that you have to meet, but that threshold is typically low. It's, in some states, it's only 15.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Or I think in California, it's even lower than that, isn't it?
I think maybe even 10. There's so many laws, I can't even keep them all straight in my head. But there are some nuances in terms of who it applies to. But regardless of the compliance concern or consideration, and I'm not saying that that's not important, we know that most organizations plan to disclose more wage ranges in their job postings, right? Because they're recognizing that that's the trend, right? That's the way, the direction employers are going, and it's helping them in the recruitment process. It's making it a more efficient process. And so regardless of whether or not you have to comply through any state law, we know from our research that most organizations are moving in this direction and expect to include wage range disclosures in their job postings. Maybe just by a quick show of hands, who's doing that now? Okay, so a lot of you are.
We had a question.
So that's a great question. So the question was, I'll paraphrase this, but if you have multi-state locations, should you be aspiring to the most stringent law and deploy that ubiquitously throughout the entire organization? I think I got that right. And so I would consider that best practice would be to do it uniformly across the entire organization. I mean, you're really sending a very, I think, difficult message to your employees if you say, we're only going to do it in those states where it's required.
Yeah.
The rest of you folks, we're not going to do it for you because we don't have to. That's really sending, a strong signal to your employees that you're not really serious about the spirit of the law and not really serious about addressing some of the underlying, the foundational, the impetus for some of these laws are to address pay equity and specifically gender and or racial pay gaps, right? That's the intent here. And so if you fail to provide this level of disclosure to some segment of your employees, think of what you're sending, what kind of message you're giving to them. David, you were going to say something?
I had one other point on this, which was what we saw early on in pay transparency, especially after Colorado passed its law, that we would see on Indeed that people would post, or companies would post, and it would say, if you're in Colorado, here's the pay range. Okay, so should I take that and then use the index to figure out what I'm going to be getting? Well, that's not really what we're talking about here. And what it could mean is you might create a new compensation strategy that says, we're going to post a national wage range, okay? And then we might use geographic differentials on here. But the best thing to do in that case is tell people about it, right? Disclose that to people. Communicate, over-communicate. What's the harm to doing that? You might actually tell people something that they need to be able to make a rational, mature decision, a business decision about whether or not they want to apply to your company, right? Is there any harm in that?
One more question here and we'll move on. Yeah, and so that's an important consideration.
She said that she was advised to post what would reasonably expect to be paid within the first year, right? Is that what you said? Okay, by California.
Yeah, I'm not an attorney, I don't give legal advice, but we know that there's a lot of latitude in terms of what needs to be posted. And so generally the language is that you have to post what you reasonably expect to pay. I'm not quite sure about the first year part, but what you can reasonably expect to pay may be just a hiring range, or it could be the full range. And so employers do have some latitude there. We get asked a lot of questions about, well, what is appropriate? And my response is, well, tell me how you're paying your current employees. Right? Before we can answer the question about what is appropriate to post in your externally facing job postings, we need to understand how you're paying your internal employees. Because if your internal employees start seeing wage ranges in job postings for their own job that doesn't align with their own, you have a problem. Right? So you want to avoid that. So I'm just going to, one more point, I know we have some international folks here as well. European Union, right? Just in the last, where are you from? You live in Berlin, right? European Union.
And this applies to you.
Yeah. Applies to you and anybody who has European operations. 27 member states, right? And now European has passed very stringent equal pay transparency directive within the last 2 months. This is really going to transform pay transparency in the European continent. There is a little bit of a window of implementation. It looks like they're moving towards sort of a 3-year implementation window in Europe. So you maybe have a little bit more time to sort of build that out. We generally don't have that luxury here in the US. Another question here?
All right, so the question is, what does it relate to? Is it relate to just base? Does it relate to everything? We're going to talk about this in a little bit, but at the end of the day, there's no reason that you can't disclose everything. And one of the reasons why what we chose to do is talk to you a little bit more holistically about total rewards. You can see that there are some things that we've already been transparent about. Now, what we're showing here is, think about the concepts that we've currently been utilizing. One is horizontal pay transparency. For those organizations that you've worked in, where you allow part of your organization to see just the relevant range of pay for the jobs that are tangential to them or around them in your salary structure. What I mean by that is, so if you have like 10 grades and you share just those that are above and below someone, think about that as horizontal pay transparency. You're showing them the range of pay that is potential for them, whether they get promoted or whether they get demoted, which we hope never happens. But that's the range that's relevant to them. Then think about vertical pay transparency, where you're sharing with them throughout the organization, you're sharing all of the relevant pay ranges for jobs that are in their hierarchy. Now, we typically will exclude executive pay for that. We won't show everything. In fact, a lot of times, you're just showing the pay scales. You're just showing the salary ranges. You're not showing what are the bonus potentials for that. I'm proud to say that I've actually seen some companies that alongside their salary structures, they'll literally have a column next to it that says, what's the bonus potential for this grade? Because we typically will tie grade to what the potential bonus is or what the target bonus percentage might be. So that's vertical pay transparency, seeing the high and lows throughout the entire structure relevant to that job or that geography. What we're talking about additionally now is the cross-firm pay transparency, where we're revealing these wage ranges to other companies. That's what we're kind of talking about now. That's really a new concept. Garry mentioned there are a few firms that have been doing this. They probably haven't been doing this a long time, although we probably know of some companies, some examples of some companies that have been very vocal about, we're not going to pay less than $70,000. I forget the name of that company. But they're not going to pay less than that. They want to pay a living wage to everybody. Well, okay, that's not what we've been doing for a long time. We've really only been focused on the internal. Now with pay transparency as the law, as we've been talking about, now we're introducing the concept of now having to share our wage ranges out externally to other people, whether it's through candidates or just posting it online as part of what we normally do when you're going to the career section of your website.
Like what you hear so far? Make sure you never miss a show by clicking subscribe. This podcast is made possible by Salary.com. Now, back to the show.
So why is it important? Is there really any need to go beyond the first one? It's really the right thing to do. I think we all can agree there is a problem in this country where people are not paid the same for the same work, right? We agree on that, right? Okay, thank goodness. We're all in the right place. So the reason that existed is because people made deals. They went in interviewing for a job and they were given a deal. Sometimes it related to the pay that they used to have from their old job. And part of the pay transparency laws, and so in fact, some of the laws that preceded pay transparency laws was you cannot ask what your former pay was. You can get around that by saying, what are your pay expectations? You still do that, right? A lot of us? Yeah. Go to salary.com and they can get what the wage ranges should be for that job. But when we're talking about pay transparency, it's really the right thing to do. Yeah. Sure, I'll back up. There are some states, it is not legal to ask how much someone makes today. And for good reason. Because if you ask them what they're making today, you could be exacerbating the problem that you are paying them unfairly in their new job. What frame of reference do those people have other than their current pay if you're not telling them what the wage range is for your job? And by asking them what they make today, and by not telling them what the current wage range is, you're going to make their next job paid unfairly as well. Does that answer your question? Again, we're not trying to give legal advice. We'll get in really big trouble if we do. So I pardon some of the ways in which we have to dance around that language, Did you mean to go?
Oh, do you want me to go back?
Do you really pushing me ahead that far? Dude. The next thing is, this touches everything. This is a big deal for all of us in this room. It's a big deal for consultants because we get a lot of work from companies who say, where do I start? This is so big. It's so big. It is big. You have to make sure your job documentation is up to speed. You have to make sure that you have your market data all up to speed. You have to make sure your salary structures are all up to speed. Everything has to be well documented. And also, somebody said, what about, I think you had mentioned, what about variable pay? Well, also, you have to make sure all the documentation about your pay programs are in plain English for all of your stakeholders to understand it. If you gave your documentation today on your variable pay plans to your employees, what would they do? What the hell is this? I don't know what this means. They will have no idea how to apply that to themselves. Now, some of you do a really good job, so I'm sorry. I wasn't trying to be broad stroke and make you all bad. But what we have to understand in HR is that they don't speak our language. We have to put a lot of these constructs, whether it's a salary structure, whether it's midpoint progression, whether it's spread, we have to put them into terms that people who never step foot in HR one day understand. And so we have to change that. And we also have to do a lot around communications because these things matter to these people now. What happens if your employees go out to the web and see their job posted with a wage range? They're going to go to their manager first. The manager's saying, well, that's something HR's doing. I don't know. I can't tell. And then what's going to happen is, and actually there was an article today that was published, I think from HBR, that said that research was done that says that what it's going to cause is, and part of the unintended consequences, that it's going to cause more compression. Because managers are going to do knee-jerk reaction and they're just going to give increases. That's the stupidest thing they could do. But without you giving them the training and the communications and the support to know what to do when that employee sees that wage range, the first thing they're going to want to do is protect that employee, protect that person from leaving, and they're going to give them an increase. The next thing is, these things are not going to get overturned. And if you're in a state that doesn't have it, as we talked about before, it doesn't mean you do nothing. What it means is you have to develop a strategy. Because either it's going to come to a state near you, or it's going to come to a state where you have employees and you need to do something about it. And your best friend here is going to be your labor attorney. They're going to help you set a strategy that works today, and it'll help as new laws come in. That was the last point, so we can move on.
Yeah, I mean, let's just switch gears and we'll talk about some of the impacts of pay transparency. We're starting to see more studies and papers being authored as it relates to understanding what this means in our organizations. And so, we have a quick kind of summary from various data sources, Harvard Business Review, SHRM, LinkedIn, Indeed, and even our own research. And so, in terms of the cons, David, I'm going to run by the cons first, and then you do the pros.
Please.
I'll give you a little bit of break here. So,
sure.
Yeah, I mean, as we said earlier, there's very positive things that could come out of pay transparency, but there are some downsides. And one of those is it does require more communication and training to explain pay differences. And that's a little bit what David was talking about, is that we have to get better at communicating about our pay practices and policies. And also, we have to get HR out from underneath of being the comp cops, right? If you are a supervisor, if you manage people, you ought to be able to have a conversation with those you supervise about pay. An intelligent, credible, confident, consistent conversation about pay. There's no reason why anyone who manages people shouldn't be able to have that conversation. But they need some help, right? And that help's going to have to come from HR. More time and effort to prepare and monitor pay transparency. Yeah, there's no question about it. I mean, we are in an environment where we have never seen more scrutiny and attention and focus on pay practices, right, over the last couple of years. I mean, David and I, we've both been doing this close to 25 years each. We've never seen a time like it. And it's only going to get worse. There's going to be more scrutiny. There's talk about new SEC regulations for publicly traded companies. We may go back to pay data reporting like we had in the Obama administration. We know that's true in California and Illinois. So it's only going to get worse. And so we need to make sure that we're putting the time and effort and committing the resources to making sure we're resolving some of those pay challenges that exist within our organization. Some of those things that are keeping us awake at night, that we're sort of putting on the back burner, hoping they're going to go away, we need to be able to address those now. David mentioned this, this concern about pay compression, right? The big issue that organizations are wrestling with is that they're concerned about having outliers within any particular job category. Because if you have an outlier, you have to explain why that person is paid differently maybe than their peers. There may be very legitimate reasons why that occurs. Of course, we can have pay differences, right? We just need to be sure that those pay differences are justified and defensible based on job-related factors. And so this concern around salary compression, particularly here in the U.S., virtually a lot of organizations we talk to, when we talk to how do they administer pay, we have a pay-for-performance program. We have a merit-based program. In some cases that may be true, and maybe the differences are minor, but when you start to sort of have employers that are paid, in some cases, significantly different than their peers, again, it could be performance, there could be other certifications, other things that are going on, we're just going to have to be able to show that we can defend it. David, pros.
The number one pro, and really you don't need to go beyond this, is pay transparency will effectively eliminate gender and racial gaps. That's all we need to say. There shouldn't be anything more that necessarily needs to be said than that, but that's the best one. It also has this really cool effect where now an employee can really feel like you're giving me the right deal. And they have more of a trust from the moment, not even the moment they get hired, from the moment they actually look at your ad. Wow, is that an old concept? They look at your website, they look at the job listing, and they go, wow, that's actually pretty cool. They have the pay range there. They're also telling me I can go to the link and see their philosophy on pay. I can see the variable pay program so I can understand what my target might be. Everything's all laid out for me. So you're building trust with someone before they ever even have a conversation with you. They don't even have to have a conversation with a recruiter. They could buy into your culture because you're going out there and you're giving them something that then they can hold on to and say, well, it's more than I make now and it's more open than I'm dealing with today. And what we see is 75% of job seekers are more likely to apply to a job when there's a pay range. That's a lot. We also see that with jobs that have pay information, receive 30% more impressions. That's really cool. These are all really, really good benefits. And yes, there are costs and there are cons. But number one was the most important one. And if we can solve for that, to me, it's worth everything.
So let's just kind of touch base on a few more things. This data comes from an article that was in the National Bureau of Economic Research. There was a Harvard Business School professor, Zoe Cullen, who did a really terrific article. If you're interested in understanding some of the implications, this is really a great read. I would encourage you to go out and get it. But, this author looked at different types of pay transparency that David talked about earlier. But one of the issues is, counterproductive peer comparisons, right? We know that employees have a protected right to talk to each other about pay. But employees don't always have the insight into somebody's prior year's experience, somebody's qualifications, or their performance for that matter. And so when employees start to talk about pay and they do these peer comparisons, they're often doing it with imprecise information, incomplete information. That's a challenge, and that's a problem, because even their perception of unfairness or favoritism or whatever it is, whatever that's going on in their mind, that becomes their reality. And that could be a problem. It can have a demoralizing effect. You want to do the next one?
The only thing I want to say about that is, why would you, or how could you counteract that? Conversations, education, communications. I know you're comparing yourselves against 3 of the other people that are doing your job, but here's why there are differences in pay. Have open communications. Garry said this before. Train your supervisors and your managers on how to answer these problems. Give them the tools to be able to have these mature conversations about pay. And then they'll be able to answer very much like that.
Yeah, and Just another issue as it relates to vertical pay transparency. David mentioned this earlier, but maybe we can expand on it. We talked about sharing not only wage ranges for the job that you're in, but perhaps maybe the full pay scale, the full salary structure within your organization. Because what that does, it gives line of sight into future earnings growth or future career development in your organization. It might give employees a pathway into understanding, maybe I do want to stay here, right? There may be other opportunities for me to continue my growth in here if we have that sort of vertical pay transparency that goes beyond just the job that we're doing, but now we're seeing what the earnings potential is for jobs and maybe other parts of the organization. So I think that can be a very positive thing. One of the big concerns is that pay transparency will lead to our employees seeking work elsewhere, right? They're going to see some posting somewhere and they're going to, shiny new penny, here we go, let's go chase the shiny new penny. And that is a very real concern. But there was this study, again, I'm referring to the article that was in the National Bureau of Economic Research. This author did some research on that very issue. And David and I talked about this, and we looked at the results, and we thought, that doesn't make any sense to us. What this researcher looked at is how employers were thinking about the impact of posting salary ranges on employee turnover between two different employee groups. High-performing employees and low-performing employees. Highest performing, lowest performing. Clearly, we want to keep our highest-performing employees, right? They're like gold, right? We don't want to let those people go. And I always thought intuitively that a higher performing employee, if they saw, maybe a salary range that was more attractive to them, that you're at risk of losing them. But this researcher found that high performing employees were less frequently to change jobs. And that low performing employees were more likely to do that. It didn't really kind of compute with me, but I don't know, maybe by show of hands in this room here, have any of you seen higher turnover of higher performing employees within your organizations as a result of pay transparency? Anybody seen that or concerned about it? Yeah, so a couple hands going up, and maybe there's something in this study. Of course, a lot depends on the pay raise you're actually giving to those high performing employees, and of course there may be other incentives that is causing them to stay.
I actually called this good news. Because if your lower performing employees are leaving because of transparency, sounds good to me.
Yeah, so this is an interesting finding. And again, every organization is probably going to experience this a little bit differently based on how you pay, right, relative to the market, and maybe based on your overall pay mix and how you manage performance management and how you link performance to pay.
Hey, are you listening to this and thinking to yourself, man, I wish I could talk to David about this? Well, you're in luck. We have a special offer for listeners of the HR Data Labs podcast. A free half-hour call with me about any of the topics we cover on the podcast or whatever is on your mind. Go to salary.com/HRDL consulting to schedule your free 30-minute call today.
So we're going to just move into avoiding the unintended consequences of pay transparency. We've talked a lot about what it is, right? What is happening, some of the observations that we're seeing, what is the impact, early days, on increased levels of pay transparency. So the question is, what can we do about it? How can we avoid some of these potential potholes or speed bumps? And, I guess the good news is there are things that you can do proactively. The bad news is there's lots of things that you need to do proactively. Right? And I know that HR teams are generally pretty thinly staffed. You have a lot on your plate already. But there's a lot of work to be done. There's a lot of housekeeping that needs to be done in order to prepare for, a deeper level inquiry, some potential disruption as a result of pay transparency, and we're all going to have to spend some time doing that. So in terms of housekeeping, one of the things that we're seeing a lot is this really needs to sort of define roles better within our organization, developing a cleaner job architecture, right? In this country, in the United States, we have come to rely upon market pricing as our predominant method of developing position hierarchies within our organizations. David, when you and I were young men, we used to spend a lot of time on job evaluation. Does anybody even talk about job evaluation anymore? We have
That's
some
shocking.
folks do.
That's awesome.
Yeah, it is. It is good, and we know that some organizations, have used those point factor systems. Right back in the 80s and 90s, we were putting point factor systems in left, right, and center, and maybe some of you have hung on to those things. But, really spending time defining your roles has a lot of advantages. One, it can help employees understand the differences between your jobs and understand why some are paid differently than others, right? Because to the extent that they're looking at two jobs and see a distinction with no difference, if you can't legitimately explain to an employee why this job is paid more than the other because of the knowledge, skills, and abilities that are needed for that job versus the other job, you potentially have a problem, right? Because employees will kind of distort that, and they'll begin to question whether or not that they're being treated unfairly. So this focus on job architecture is something that we're seeing an increasing amount of focus on. Anybody here involved in significant job architecture work? So some of you are already seeing that, right? A lot of hands actually going up in the room.
That's great.
For those of you that are doing it, is it a result of concerns around pay equity or pay transparency? It's all driven by that. Okay, consistent with what we're finding and seeing in the marketplace.
And now that you've actually gone ahead and done all of that work on your job architecture and you've defined your job descriptions again, because all of you have done that within the last 2 or 3 years, right? Because jobs haven't changed at all since the pandemic, right? Yeah, right. Work from home does change job duties and responsibilities. So you might want to actually look at what you're expecting people to do as part of that slide. Having that consistent approach to now documenting those jobs and documenting those differences and keeping them modern means now you need to go back and do your market pricing again. And for those of you who don't match year after year after year, you definitely need to do it once you change job content, because it will change the job that you're matching to. And for those of us who've been doing compensation for a very long time, we know that there are slight differences in matches that make a lot of difference. And if you're trying to explain to an employee why you're paying them a certain way, and God forbid you have to show them the market pricing with the job description that goes against that market pricing, and they say, this has nothing to do with what I do, or it's only part of my job. How do you explain that? Well, when you do a good job market pricing, now you can say it's explainable. The one thing people always ask consultants when we go to do their market pricing is, hey, that's a perfect match, isn't it? There is literally no such thing as a perfect match. The surveys and the survey taxonomies and the survey descriptions are there as a guideline. We use that terminology. This is an art as much as it is a science, because while we do use percentiles to describe the population, and we're using that to see what sampling is for that job, this is literally an art form. Because you're going to take that data. For those of you who know compensation stuff, you're going to age the data, if you know what I'm talking about. You're going to create a hybrid job, if you know what I'm talking about. Do you think that's what's intended when someone sends in their market pricing matches? No, they're saying, this is the job that someone does. I'm using like 80-20 rule on their match. This is good enough. But now you're taking that data and you're creating this science around it. Don't be too scientific. Don't beat yourself up if the match isn't perfect. But you at least have to have something that's explainable to the manager and to the employee. Because if you can't explain it to them, it's a worthless exercise. Okay? And can you go to the next slide?
Sure.
Everybody knows what this is? Those are the salary structures that you create. This is just a screenshot of our tool. But one of the things that we do when we create these structures is we're trying to approximate the market for our jobs. And the bottom is the minimum, the midpoint is what you see along the line, and then the top is the maximum. Putting rigor into this to create the perfect salary structure is a waste of time. Because again, this is an approximation of our market. We're using market matches, which we just talked about aren't perfect, and now we're going to create a salary structure. I will tell you that a lot of times when I create structures these days, I'm not creating one structure, which is what this one is trying to do. I'll create 3, at least. One for non-exempt roles, one for exempt roles, and one for executives, because they're all going to have different slopes. They're all going to have different ways in which they start trending up or down. Actually, the non-exempt looks much more like the executive nowadays than the executive does, but that's different. Don't put too much stock or don't put too much work into creating these structures, but make sure, again, it's explainable. You can explain it to your leaders, You can explain it to your managers. And now, fresh, you're going to have to explain it to employees and the candidates, because these are the wage ranges you're going to use to explain the market for jobs that you're looking to attract. Does that make sense? Okay.
Yeah, and another area where we're seeing our clients spend a lot of time is doing sort of a full-blown pay equity analysis, a full-blown pay equity audit, so that they can identify potential outliers in their pay models and address those proactively. You know, one of the big issues, and we talked a little bit about this in terms of job architecture, is today's standard for pay equity is performing equal pay for comparable work, right? Back in 1963 or 2, whenever the Equal Pay Act, it was equal pay for equal work. We could all understand that. Conceptually, we could get our heads around it. But nowadays, the standard is equal pay for comparable work, and so we need to understand comparable work. I mentioned earlier that we moved away from job evaluation, using job evaluation in our country. We use on market pricing. Guess what? Market pricing is not a good way to define comparable work in many cases. And so some of you already started doing some job architecture work, and that's a way to solve for that, right? And be able to develop comparable work groups so that when you do a statistical analysis, you know that you're comparing apples to apples. You know, and the key here is making sure that you want to identify a statistically significant pay disparities that are obviously impacting women and any minorities in your organization. And if you don't have the skill set, maybe the bandwidth or the internal resource to be able to do that, maybe go out and find some external resource, because this is important.
We know some consultants that know how to do that too.
I know a good consultant knows how to do that work. But yeah, and leverage technology, right? And now this is hard to do, this work, because there's so many moving parts and there's some complexity to it. Obviously, the larger your organization, the more complex it becomes. But leverage technology. We're a technology company. We have technology solutions that make it easier. That's the business we're in. But there's a real need to kind of focus and invest in this particular area. We know the states like Illinois requires equal pay certification, right? If you're an employer in Illinois, you have to get equal pay certified. And it's difficult to be able to do that unless you've done a full-blown pay equity analysis. We know other states are requiring pay data reporting, right? EEO-1 pay data reporting by gender and race. And of course, when we think about pay equity, we think about it pretty broadly. We think about not only just sort of focusing on those potential illegal pay disparities, but we also focus on the pay gaps that exist, right? Having a pay gap is not an illegal pay practice, right? But it's not a good thing. And that's what pay transparency laws are specifically designed to impact, right? We want to reduce or eliminate gender and or racial pay gaps in our U.S. workforce. And that's why we have these pay transparency laws.
But just to put a finer point on that, gaps may still exist, and you mentioned this before, because of some factors that may exist, like education and experience and other things,
yes.
Right?
Yeah. I mean, you've got the unadjusted gap and the adjusted pay gap. So you need to kind of look at it both ways. But, having a pay gap is less about pay than it is about representation across your organizational hierarchy. Right. And that's the real challenge or issue. We know that that's a problem, right? We don't have enough minorities and women, particularly in some of the higher tier jobs that are being paid, at the top of the range. And so, the work in pay equity is really important. When we talk about pay equity, people kind of get really sucked into sort of the statistical modeling and the numbers on this. And, I like to step back and think that pay equity really needs to be managed within what I call a tolerable threshold. What is a tolerable threshold? Well, I don't think the goal here is to try to come up with perfect equity. I'm not even sure that in most organizations you could reach a consensus around what perfect equity is. But we need to be able to manage pay equity, as I said, within a tolerable threshold. And I define that as making sure your pay practices are consistent with your organizational culture, your values, and particularly your diversity, equity, inclusion goals, right? We know that diversity, equity, inclusion is a strategic priority for virtually every organization in the United States. But if you're not addressing pay equity as part of your DEI goal, I think you're selling yourself short, right? Those two things go hand in glove, right? They are two sides of the same coin. So if you have a really proactive, very strong diversity, equity, inclusion strategy, you should also be focusing on pay equity. And in addition to that, you also need to minimize the risk or liability, right? You obviously want to avoid any potential legal liability as a result of any paid discrimination claim. And, risk tolerance is a consideration here. Some organizations are very conservative, right? They're going to have a much higher level, less tolerance than maybe some other types of employers. And so your risk tolerance really should shape, again, your pay equity threshold. And the last thing is that you need to be able to manage pay equity in a way which supports your recruitment and retention goals, right? We know that employees want to work for organizations that share their values, right? That have, sort of a mission and a culture that's aligned with their own personal values. And so much of what we're looking for in the workplace today is fairness in the workplace and equal opportunity. And certainly conducting a pay equity analysis should take into all these considerations so that you can manage it within a threshold which is right for your organization, right? It could be slightly different for different organizations based on your culture and some of your priorities and some of the things that you're wrestling with. But I think that from a pay equity perspective, there's an awful lot of work that needs to be done there. Of course, pay transparency is sort of, putting a microscope on all of that. And that's going to be an important piece of work. Well, Dave, let's talk about, you already talked about documenting your compensation program. You want to talk a little bit more about that?
Yes, everybody's got their programs documented, right? They're all readable. Every employee has access to them. Thank you. That's awesome. Can you actually publish them so we can all see them? Oh, that's you're getting there. Okay. Not there yet. Got to make sure they're documented well. You got to make sure they're documented in a language that people can understand. And I'm very particular about using that word, language. There are people who do not speak English in this country. So make sure that you're translating it to language that they feel comfortable with, whatever that language is. Make sure that all of these pieces, they have something that people can understand because they're all pretty complex.
Yeah, well, we touched on this a little bit earlier, but maybe just a couple of seconds on this. Yeah, prepare your managers, right? HR shouldn't be the only people who can talk about pay in an organization. It's untenable, right? You just can't manage, pay expectations if that's the case in your organization. And so, we have a whole competency model, but one of the competencies we've developed is communication about pay, right? And so every manager and supervisor ought to be given the information and skills and training they need to be able to do that effectively and consistently throughout the organization. Anybody doing that, by the way? Anybody training your managers yet?
Excellent. Thank you.
Pay? Good for you.
Thank you. That's wonderful. Good job.
Not an easy thing to do, right? And that can be a real challenge, and I'm sure there's lots of questions along the way, but it certainly is important work. So
did we answer all your questions as we were going through, so we're not going to worry about Q&A at the end? Somebody has to answer that, though, because it might be a really important question.
So it varies. So different states have different laws on this, and I don't want to shoot from the hip on that because it depends on the state that you're talking about. But
I think it was California, right? Oh, okay.
Yeah,
right.
In some states, I know it's when at the time they submit their application. In other cases, it's upon request. Another question over here.
If you're expecting to hire them elsewhere, then you don't need to. No.
Yeah.
No.
But if you have employees in other states where it's required, you might want to think about that strategy because you're really sending a mixed message out. Another question here? Yeah, so that's based on your compensation philosophy. So some organizations will use a national market, others will use sort of geographic pay differentials, but that should be really guided by your philosophy and your retention challenges and recruitment challenges. And that type of thing.
She was asking, they hire everybody virtually, and my advice, very similar to him, would be to start with national. But yeah.
I just want to maybe make one more comment. We spend a lot of time trying to understand how organizations are going to approach their performance evaluation, performance management processes in the face of more great pay transparency. Of course, the big concern was that organizations will start to compress salaries, right? Because the fear of outliers if they giving significant pay differences to high performers. And so our research here is just basically told us that organizations are going to continue to do what they're doing in terms of performance evaluation, but they're going to spend a lot more time on it. They're going to make sure that their performance management processes are more robust, perhaps eliminating some of the subjectivity in their performance evaluation processes, perhaps calibrate across the organization to make sure that there is some consistency in terms of the outcomes and pay decisions linked to pay. So that's an important part, I think, of the work that needs to be done in the face of pay transparency. But that's an important consideration. We're just about 1 minute away from time. Maybe just another couple of questions.
So what you're saying is, do we have documentation that we have around pay plans Yeah, so yes, we do, but they really do need to be configured and customized for your organization. But yeah, we do that, yeah. We help companies with that. Yes, ma'am. Okay, so let me play this back. So if you've hired someone in a particular location, and that's what you've hired them for, and then they say, what if I move? I'm in a high cost area now. What if I move somewhere else? My advice is, if it's just them moving themselves, tell them, look, I'm not going to pay you differently for moving where you're moving. This is your responsibility. But if you're moving from a low-cost area to a high-cost area, I'm not going to pay you more necessarily. It's all based on the deal that you made with them. Oh, okay. Sorry. You answered it yourself. You said that if someone lives in a low-cost area, but they see a posting for a high-cost area, and they see the differential. That's the reason why there's a differential, because the posting is for the high-cost area. That's why I'm saying that when you communicate these ranges, be explicit as to what they're for. Say, if this range is for Southern California, or this is for the cities in California, because they're all kind of high cost in the cities, but not for rural California. However that works out, if you see the differential from where people actually work to where you're posting the job, be explicit about it and communicate it. Tell them what it's for. My advice, though, is pull it back and be more generic, like we were saying, using the national averages, and say, this is based on the national market. There will be pay differentials on where you live or where you work. But and I go back to my other point, though, that I don't know if I finished. If you're hiring someone in a particular location and then they move to a lower cost area or a higher cost area, you may not necessarily have that same deal with them. But if they want to move on their own, you don't have any obligation to pay them more or less. That's up to you as a philosophy.
Folks, I want to be respectful of time. We're at the bottom of the hour here. David and I are going to hang around for a few minutes. If you're welcome to come and talk to us afterwards. I want to thank you for your
yes, thank you very much.
Being here today.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Garry and David. Don't forget to complete your survey.
That was the HR Data Labs podcast. If you liked the episode, please subscribe. And if you know anyone that might like to hear it, please send it their way. Thank you for joining us this week, and stay tuned for our next episode. Stay safe.